Today's the second of 3 or more classes on mindfulness and resilience. Last week we did resilience and interoception, which is how well you can feel your body. I can introduce you to the earliest part of the concept of how, through mindfulness meditation, you're connecting to your body. It's more like, I prefer the term mind-body connection, and I'll be using that terminology in future instead of interoception. And there are another couple of areas that most obviously mindfulness practices and mindfulness meditation build resilience. Today's is unhelpful thoughts, how the meditations help us to work with unhelpful thoughts. And this is not using the noting unhelpful thoughts practice, which is what I teach on the courses. Right? This is just noticing the breath. So most people, when they begin to learn to meditate, they learn to meditate through focusing on the breath. And so we're taught, we notice the breath, and then the mind wanders, and then we bring our attention back to the breath, and then we repeat that over and over again. I have never heard anybody other than me explain the mechanism, what's going on here. Although it's one of these things that are pretty obvious when you actually sit down to think about it, because that process, the common name for it is mindfulness of the breath. For a long time, it's been called following the breath. Sometimes it's called the breathing meditation, whatever it happens to be. And it's not about the breath. It's about the moment when you notice that your mind's wandered. So this is what happened when you start learning to meditate. And these are the things that go wrong with almost everybody. We start to learn to meditate because we want to calm our minds, or because we want to calm our physiology, and that whole thing is bundled up, and we're taught that that's stress. So this is anxiety and physiological stress and worry bundled up in the modern world as stress. So I'm feeling stressed, and somebody says you should go along to meditation classes, that will sort you out. So you come along, and what you want to do is calm your mind. What you want, hands up anybody who doesn't want the Jedi-like ability to silence their mind at will. You don't want to do that. Right? Who doesn't want to do that? Of course, everybody wants to do that. So underlying that question is that that's what we all want. We want this Jedi mind skill to silence the mind, or to calm it. It's busy, I want to calm that. Or to calm the body, I'm feeling emotional. I think my emotions are not appropriate, they're not helpful right now, so I want to calm my emotions, thoughts, all in a big tangle. I want to calm that down. Then we're taught, you just sit and you notice the breath, mind wanders, back to the breath again. And you don't think about it and don't worry how many times the mind wanders. But we're not taught what's actually going on. What's going on is obvious if you look at it, because there isn't that much going on. You're noticing the breath, your mind wanders, you notice that the mind's wandered, and you bring your attention back to the breath. That moment of noticing that the mind's wandered has got a name. It's called the moment of recognition. There's a Buddhist meditation teacher, to clarify again, I'm not religious, but I'll take wisdom wherever it's found, Tulku Urgyen Rinpoche, who popped up with a statement that liberation, in other words, being free of all of your mental baggage and just being able to connect to your present moment, is experiencing the moment of recognition over and over again. Because when you notice that, there's all sorts of things that happen. One is you realize that whatever scenario is running in your mind isn't real. You know that it might happen in the future, or you might be replaying something from the past. So it might be a valid mental movie from the past or the future, but it's not happening right now. So you're teaching yourself that it's your mind and that it isn't here. And the reason you have to do this over and over and over again is because you've spent decades believing it is, believing it's true. There you are in the scenario. And, this person says this. And so what you do in the scenario is you pop up in your mind and you say that as if it's real. And while all this is playing out in your head, it's a narrative and it will continue. Okay, so you're noticing that the narrative in the mind isn't real in the present moment, real anyway, what you can see here, smell, touch, and taste. And you're learning, you're training yourself through gentle repetition to become more aware that your mind's wandered. So one of my favorite definitions of mindfulness is probably my favorite definition actually, is awareness of unawareness. We're noticing that we're not aware. We're noticing that our mind's in a scenario. It's a very small universe once you separate it from all of the baggage in your head. The small universe consists of phenomena. Phenomena is what you can see, hear, smell, touch, and taste, and your thoughts and your emotions and how your body feels and your balance and where you are in the room and all of the everything that's going on in your body, all of the visual information, all the sound, all bundled into one. That's known as phenomena. So they're sense perceptions. If you have a difficult emotion, you can feel it in your body. You're using the same sort of nervous system that you use to feel the desk. It's just you're using it in a slightly different way. So it's a feeling in the body. There's the emotion, it's a feeling in the body. And the thoughts, when you notice that the mind's wandered and you come back to the sensory experience of now, the undistracted awareness of the experience of the present moment, you learn that you're not your thoughts. So you're not your thoughts, you're not your emotions. What are you? You're the awareness that's aware of all of this. That's what we'll be covering next week. We'll be doing it from the perspective of resilience. And so from the perspective of resilience, the capacity to release, let go of a train of thoughts and come back to the sensory experience of now through the breath is an incredibly powerful tool, because the alternative is to live in those thoughts, and those thoughts aren't always necessarily on your side. Not all of us think in language. Just out of curiosity, does everybody think in language, or do you have images in your mind? Anyone that thinks with images and symbols? You think in images and symbols? Anybody just thinks in language? Your dialogue, your dialogue. And you guys, you'll be somewhere in between. Yeah, that's pretty standard. Now, it doesn't matter if it's symbols or images, at the same, it's still a narrative. So the mental movie, it can be a silent movie. It doesn't need language. Or it could be radio. And it doesn't matter, if anybody's listened to radio plays, they can be as immersive, if not more, than silent movies. Watch a silent movie, that can be immersive. So it doesn't matter. It's a narrative, it's a story. It's connected to the past and connected to the future. And it's connected to how you believe you are and what you believe other people believe you are, what you've thought in the past, what you believe will happen in the future, all of the people that you interact with muddled up into this one thing. And what we're doing is letting go of it all to come back and notice the breath. And why do we have to do it for years and years? Because we're unraveling decades of mental movie. Mental movie's been running since we were kids. Monsters under the bed, the imaginary friends, the wars in the playground. And then it just continues throughout our lives where there's this reflection of our external experience in these mental movies. So what you're doing is you're letting go of the mental movie every time. And it has to be done over and over again because you've spent 10 decades of immersion in the mental movie. And so we're addicted to the mental movie and we keep getting drawn into it and we believe it. And then we're learning to let it go bit by bit. So we have to do it over and over again. So every time we notice the mind's wandered, our subconscious has gone, I don't fancy another 5 minutes of me beating myself up in my head or deciding how terrible the world is or how wrong somebody is or how bad somebody is or how bad my life's going to be or what I believe other people believe about. I don't need that. Put that glass of mental wine on hold, come back to the breath and repeat. And that's why. That's why we do it. That's the main reason. A lot of others, introception, I mentioned last week. And then we're also becoming aware of the awareness, and that's what I'll cover on probably Thursday. So let's do some of this, noticing the breath, the mind wandering, and bringing our attention back to the breath again. And we'll begin by noticing the sound of the bell moving through time. And notice all other sound moving through time. Notice the hubbub of sound. Ticking of the clock, sound of traffic, the occasional airplane, movements in the room, movements in the building, sound of my voice, a little bit of bird song, the sound of the breath. And the sensation of the breath. Wherever you choose to notice it, the most frictionless place for newcomers is to notice the rising and falling of the belly. But the other common focus is on the sensation of the air as it enters and leaves the nostrils. And it doesn't matter. As you can tell from this talk, this isn't actually about the breath. And it doesn't matter how long the mind wanders. If the mind wanders for a long time, the inner narrative becomes more powerful. So when you notice that, it's more valuable than if the narrative is short. If the mind wandering is short, you notice, back to the breath, notice, back to the breath. It's like lifting little weights. If your mind goes deeply into some scenario, carries you off, when you notice, bring your attention back. That's like lifting a big weight. And what we'll do is place our elbows by the side, heads balanced comfortably. If you're seated, ideally, this is all ideal, comfort's the most important thing. Feet flat on the floor. And practice this for the next few minutes, noticing the breath, mind wanders. Return our attention to the breath and repeat. This is called following the breath. Just noticing the rising and falling. If the mind is busy, you can hijack your inner voice or your inner image stream or your inner sensory experience. And what you do is you repeat in your mind while the belly rises, so in the mind rising, and while the belly falls, so in the mind falling, rising, falling. Doesn't matter how many times the mind wanders, and it doesn't matter for how long. If the mind wanders 1,000 times, we gently, patiently, compassionately return our attention to the breath 1,000 times. Cool breath in, warm breath out. And we're now going to give ourselves a little assistance in this process of noticing that the mind's wandered. What we want to do is acknowledge the moment of recognition. So there we are, noticing the breath. The mind wanders. We notice that the mind's wandered, and we return our attention to the breath. On noticing, we acknowledge it by noting it in our minds, by saying in the mind, thinking, thinking. And then we bring our attention back to the breath. Noticing the breath, mind wanders, or a thought arises if your mind's entirely quiet. And when you notice that you have either mind wandered or that a thought has arisen, if your mind's very clear, you acknowledge that by saying in the mind, thinking, thinking. Back to the breath. Noticing the breath, thought arises or the mind wanders. Say in the mind, thinking, thinking, could be words, could be images. Back to the breath and repeat. And so now you see part of the power of noting or acknowledging the moment of recognition. And practice this for a few minutes. This is called noting thoughts. So now we're going to go a bit deeper with that. And we will sort the thoughts out when they arise. So if we either notice our mind's wandered or thoughts have arisen, what we want to know is, do we recognize that narrative or those thoughts? Is it a familiar story? Is it a familiar narrative? Do we totally remember it? If we're not sure or we don't remember it, that goes into the second bucket. We don't actually do anything with this. It's neither good nor bad. It's just a way of connecting to thoughts at an earlier stage. So we're waiting for thoughts to arise. We're in the present moment. If you want to know if you're in the present moment, check that you're noticing the passage of time. Then you're present. Thought arises. Do we recognize it? If we recognize it, we say in the mind, repeating. And if we're not sure or we don't recognize it, we say in the mind, fleeting. And we're back to the breath, noticing the breath rising and falling. If a thought arises or the mind wanders, same thing. Do we recognize it? If we recognize it, say repeating. If we don't recognize it, say in the mind, fleeting. Back to the breath. Await the arrival of some more thoughts. It's only a matter of time. Recognize it, repeating. Don't recognize it, fleeting. Back to the breath, repeat. This is noting the quality of thoughts. don't worry if the mind moves into a dreamy place. So you go from mind wandering into a hypnagogic state, which is the waking you, but a dream. You're kind of aware that you're awake. It's worth staying in that. It's almost universally enjoyable. If it's not enjoyable, return your attention to the breath and continue. But this meditation promotes that dream state, the hypnagogic state. If your mind goes in there, that's okay. You stay in the hypnagogic state. You won't fall asleep. If you do, your head will nod and that will wake you up. When you wake up again, see if you can continue from where you were in the hypnagogic state rather than forcing yourself awake. Noticing the breath, thought arises, we recognize it, saying the mind repeating. We're not sure we recognize it, or we don't recognize it, saying the mind fleeting, and repeat. And now noticing the movement of sound through time and the movement of the belly through time, the rising and falling of the belly. Notice that this movement through time of sound and the movement of the belly are synchronized. And notice the movement of the sound of the bell through time. And then whenever you're ready, in your very own time, gently return your attention to your surroundings.